Senate now has before it for final consideration Senate Bill 1042. Secretary will read the bill.
In the Senate, Senate Bill number 1042 by Commerce and Human Resources Committee, an act relating to the health insurance exchange. Provide a short title.
Mr. President.
Senator Tippets.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that further reading of Senate Bill 1042 to be dispensed with, and the journal show it's been read the third time at length, section by section, and placed before the Senate for final consideration.
You've heard the unanimous consent request. Is there objection? Hearing none, is so ordered. Senator Tippets is recognized to open debate on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senators, here we are. We're going to vote today. At least I hope we're going to vote today. Others may have a different idea on an issue that we've been studying for months. It's a complicated issue, and it's a very contentious issue. I understand that, and I appreciate the fact that we have a long history of debating very divisive issues in a respectful and deliberative way in the Idaho State Senate. I expect it to be no different today. Most of us don't want an exchange under the terms of the Affordable Care Act. If we had the ability to opt out, most of us would, but we don't have that option. Given the options we do have, I believe that a state-based exchange is a better choice than a federal exchange for Idaho. Let's first look at what the bill does and doesn't do, then we'll talk some more about our options or lack thereof under the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. I'd like you to pay particularly close attention to the stated purpose and intent found on page 1, lines 18 through 32. Some may say that such a statement is superfluous. I believe it is much more, because it explains what we intend by passage of this legislation. It's important enough to me that I want to read that to you. Mr. President, may I read from the bill?
Senator may read from the bill.
It's the public policy of the state of Idaho to actively resist federal actions that would limit or override state sovereignty under the 10th Amendment of the United States Constitution. Through this legislation, the state of Idaho asserts its sovereignty by refusing to surrender decision-making authority over health care issues, which are matters appropriately left to states and individual citizens. The purpose of this chapter is to establish a state-created, market-driven health insurance exchange that will facilitate the selection and purchase of individual and employer health benefit plans. The creation of a state-based health insurance exchange will provide an Idaho-specific solution that fits the unique needs of the state of Idaho. Participation in the exchange is voluntary in that no Idaho citizen or employer shall be required by this chapter to purchase a health benefit plan through the exchange. Creation of the exchange and its operation is deemed a public purpose intended to enhance Idaho residents' choice regarding options and access to health insurance. That is our statement of purpose and intent. And it makes it clear that the state of Idaho intends to actively resist federal actions that infringe on the rights granted to the states under the 10th Amendment of the United States Constitution. Now let's look at the rest of the bill. Section 41-6103 contains definitions that are used throughout the chapter, so let me mention just a couple of those specifically. When the word director is used in the bill, it refers to the director of the Department of Insurance of the state of Idaho. The definition of producer in the bill merely refers us to a code section. The definition that's found there is that producer means a person required to be licensed under the laws of the state to sell, solicit, or negotiate insurance, essentially an insurance agent. Section 41-6104, which begins on line 15 of page 2, creates the exchange and the board. The exchange is to be known as the Idaho Health Insurance Exchange and is established as an independent body, corporate and politic. This structure allows us to maintain appropriate control over the exchange while providing significant independence for the exchange. Further, it isolates the exchange in the state so that the state is not responsible for the liabilities of the exchange. And I think that's an important consideration. We had the option to make the exchange part of state government. The gentleman on the second floor did not want to grow state government and wanted to keep the cost to the state as low as possible. The federal law allows for the exchange to be a nonprofit, but the state can't create a corporation, so a model was chosen that's similar to other quasi-state entities like the State Insurance Fund, the Idaho Housing and Finance Association, and the High Risk Pool. You'll note in subsection 2, beginning on line 20, that the exchange is not a state agency, but will operate subject to the supervision and control of its board. Subsection 3 describes the makeup of the board. The board consists of 16 members total. 14 are voting members: the Director of the Department of Health and Welfare or his or her designee, and the Director of the Department of Insurance or his or her designee are ex officio, non-voting members of the board. The exception is that in the case of a tie vote, the Director of the Department of Health and Welfare is entitled to vote to break a tie. The 14 voting members of the board are appointed by and serve at the pleasure of the gentleman on the second floor. Another important control measure, I think, in the legislation. And you will find specifics regarding these board members beginning on line 39. 3 members will represent different health carriers. 2 members represent producers. 3 additional members will represent individual consumer interests. 4 members will represent small business interests, with one of the 4 representing employers with between 1 and 10 employees. Another will represent employers with between 11 and 25 employees. And 1 will represent employers with 26 or more employees. The 4th member, representing small employer businesses, may represent any category of small employer. The 2 remaining voting board members will represent healthcare providers. The 14 voting members will serve 4-year terms or until a successor is appointed, and the board member may serve subsequent terms. Subsection 6, beginning on line 20, makes it clear that board members are not employees of the state by virtue of their service on the board. Subsection 8 mandates that all meetings of the board shall be held in accordance with the open meeting law. Subsection 9 on lines 31 and 32 requires the board to contract for an annual audit by an independent third party. And subsection 10 states that the board will develop, adapt, and adopt and implement procurement policies and guidelines. Section 416105, beginning on line 35 of page 3, enumerates the powers and authority of the exchange. The highlights contained therein are subsection 1B, to adopt bylaws. The bylaws will be subject to the review and approval of the Director of the Department of Insurance, and any changes to the bylaws will require the Director's consent. One of the concerns that's been expressed about a state health insurance exchange is the lack of control by the state. So please notice that this is one avenue for state control of the exchange. The fact that the Director of the Department of Insurance has authority to approve or disapprove the bylaws, and they may not be changed without the Director's approval. Subsection 1C, which begins on line 43 of page 3, gives the exchange the authority to assess and collect fees from participating health carriers, exchange users, or participants, and to receive funds from any other source that shall be used solely for the purposes of this chapter. The exchange is given the authority to appoint advisory committees as needed, to take legal action to recover any amounts lawfully owed to the exchange, to enter into contracts, and to develop, adopt, and implement a plan of operation. There are also enumerated limitations placed on the power and authority of the exchange, and I think it's important to note these. They're found in subsection 2, beginning on line 7 of page 4, and these limitations include the following. In subsection A, the exchange will not have the power to alter its own legal structure. B, the exchange must be financially self-supporting. And I want to emphasize that. The exchange must be financially self-supporting and shall not request any financial support from the state and shall not have the power to tax or encumber state assets. In subsection 2C, the exchange is explicitly prohibited from requiring any person to use or participate in the exchange, nor does it have the authority to impose upon or collect from a person any penalty for failure or refusal to participate in the exchange or to purchase a health benefit plan or standalone dental plan. Subsection 2D clearly states that any health benefit plan or standalone dental plan offered by any health carrier may be sold in the exchange as long as the plan meets all the requirements of applicable law and of the exchange. I think, again, that's a very important provision. This legislation creates an open market. It essentially says anyone can participate as long as you're willing to meet the requirements. Anyone can offer a product for sale as long as they're willing to meet the requirements. The Department of Insurance anticipates there will be dozens of plans offered through the exchange. That may not be the case with the federal exchange. Subsection 2E prohibits the exchange from attempting to preclude any health carrier from offering insurance outside the exchange. F deals with the issue of insurance agents or producers, as they are referred to here. It clearly states that any producer participating in the exchange shall be entitled to payment for his services through written plea agreements with the individuals or small employers utilizing the services of said producer or through commissions offered by health carriers participating in the exchange. G states that the state of Idaho shall not be liable for any obligations of the exchange. And H makes it clear that the board is not liable for obligations of the exchange. Further, it exempts board members from liability for any acts or omissions related to the performance of their powers and duties unless those acts or omissions constitute willful or wanton misconduct. Section 41-6106, starting at the bottom of page 4, requires the exchange to submit a written report of its activities and the condition of the exchange to the director, the gentleman on the second floor, and the director of Legislative Services Office for distribution to all legislators on or before January 31st, 2014, and on or before January 31st, in subsequent years. Section 41-6107 is found on page 5. Allows the exchange to rely upon work performed by the directors of the Department of Insurance and the Department of Health and Welfare, and makes it clear that no action taken by the exchange pursuant to this chapter shall be construed to preempt or supersede the authority of the director of the Department of Insurance to regulate the business of insurance within the state. Additionally, the bill includes a severability clause and declares an emergency, which means that the bill would be in effect upon its passage and approval. So, Senators, that's the bill. Now let's discuss some of the issues related to health insurance exchanges. Senate Bill 1042, in my mind, is rather unique in that most of the discussion and maybe most of the opposition to the bill is not found in the bill itself, but rather in the idea of establishing a state-based health insurance exchange at all. So let's talk about those issues a bit. First, let me say that I personally am opposed to the federal government mandating that every state have a health insurance exchange and mandating to a great extent how the exchange will operate. I personally oppose the Affordable Care Act. I hoped and believed that the U.S. Supreme Court would declare the law unconstitutional. When I first heard about the provision in the law that required private citizens to purchase insurance or face a penalty, my initial reaction was that that could not possibly be constitutional. I still believe that. But the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the law. I don't personally agree with their decision, but the U.S. Constitution gives the Supreme Court the authority to determine the legality of the actions of Congress, and not me. I then hoped we would have a change in administration at the federal level that would facilitate repeal of the law. That didn't happen either. So here we are. On January 1, 2014, we will have a state health insurance exchange, a federal exchange, or some combination of the two. That is a fact. The federal government has been preparing to implement a federal exchange in Idaho if necessary, and if we do not create a state exchange, they will create a federal exchange for us. They will create a federal exchange for us. They're already working on it. So let's talk about some of the many issues that we should carefully consider when deciding whether Idaho should have a state exchange or default to a federal exchange. There are those who would say we should just wait and let the dust settle a bit before we make a decision on an exchange. Typically, that argument would be persuasive with me. I like to have all the facts I can get before making a decision, almost to a fault. And I understand the benefits to watching and waiting and learning from others going through a process so that we can avoid making the mistakes that they make along the way. In this case, however, I don't believe we have that luxury. As previously mentioned, if we don't establish an exchange by the end of the year, we will have a federal exchange imposed upon us. The argument's made that we could always change our minds if we default to a federal exchange and later implement a state exchange. That is true. That option is available. However, in order to do so, we would have to give the federal government notice more than a year in advance, and we would then be required to pay the cost associated with establishing a state exchange ourselves. The final date to apply for federal funding of a state-based exchange is October 15, 2014, middle of October next year. After that date, we are on our own as far as funding the exchange. Now, I admit I'm not a fan of taking federal funds simply because we can. I know we rely on federal funds for many of the programs that we operate at the state level. And I know the argument can be made that we shouldn't be reluctant to accept funds because they really belong to us anyway. My concern is, and always has been, that federal funds typically come with lots of strings attached. And we know that over 40% of the funds the federal government spends are simply borrowed. That worries me. In fact, it worries me a lot. I do think in this situation, however, that since the federal government is mandating that we establish an exchange, either a federal or a state exchange, against our better judgment, that it is appropriate that they provide the funding. And I believe that either we will spend federal dollars establishing a state fund, a state exchange, or they will spend a significant portion, if not all of those same dollars, establishing a federal exchange for us. And I want to say that one more time. I believe that either we will spend federal dollars establishing a state exchange for Idaho, or they will spend a significant portion, if not all of those same funds, establishing a federal exchange for us. How much is it going to cost to set up a state-based health insurance exchange? That's a legitimate question. The exchange will have access to the $20.3 million grant already obtained by the state, and the department tells me they could need up to another $10 million, which would also come to the state in the form of a grant. That's why the fiscal note was revised to indicate a fiscal impact of $30 million. We do believe that's the upper end of the cost. That's a lot of money. 2 years ago, I voted against the appropriations bill for the Department of Insurance, as did many of you, because it included a $2.5 million grant to be used in planning for an exchange. If I thought we could save the $30 million by not establishing an exchange, that would be tempting to me. But there are costs associated with establishing an exchange, whether it's a state exchange or a federal exchange. And if Idaho does not establish a state exchange, the federal government will spend a considerable amount of money establishing a federal exchange for Idaho. I don't know the exact figure. Nobody does. We've tried to get that. They don't know. But it's going to be something on the order of what we'll spend as a state. I can't tell you how their costs would compare to ours. But again, it's very expensive to create an exchange at either level. In addition to shifting the cost from the federal government to the state, defaulting to a federal exchange would likely have other consequences, such as limiting access to the exchange by qualified providers and thus limiting consumer choices. Senate Bill 1042 explicitly provides for an open market where all qualifying health carriers may participate inside and outside of the state exchange. There is no similar assurance with a federal exchange. It is likely that a federal exchange will impose a restricted market or active purchaser model, contracting with only selected carriers, particularly after the initial setup year. We believe there's more flexibility going to be allowed initially, but then there will be a review, and it's likely, or at least possible, that they'll trim the number of providers allowed to participate in the exchange back significantly. Defaulting to a federal exchange may also impact the ability of agents and brokers to participate in an exchange, as the federal exchange is expected to be designed to primarily use navigators to assist consumers, whereas it's the intention of the Director of the Department of Insurance to design the system in the state exchange in a way that allows us to use the experience of the nearly 5,600 insurance agents in the state. And Senators, I would say that's significant. The Director of the Department of Health and Welfare, Dick Armstrong, tells me that the state will be able to do a much better job of administering a state-based exchange than the federal government will do with the federal exchange. We're confident the state will be able to operate with lower administrative costs than a federal exchange, and we believe the citizens of the state of Idaho would prefer to talk to someone in Idaho when they have a problem as opposed to talking to someone outside of the state working for a federal exchange. Administering other federal programs, Idaho has proven that we are second to none at delivering quality service in a timely manner, keeping errors low, reducing customer complaints, and overall delivering high-quality service to the citizens of Idaho. A state exchange will be able to contract with the vendors we deem most appropriate to service the needs of our state. Director Armstrong told me that the Department of Health and Welfare prefers a state exchange partly because they'll be able to partner with someone in Idaho rather than with someone in Washington, D.C. We think that will make for a much more efficient, much more user-friendly, and lower-cost system, he said. There are other advantages of a state exchange over a federal exchange. Director Deal has provided me with a list of advantages they see in establishing a state-based exchange rather than defaulting to a federal exchange. Let me hit some highlights. Some of those advantages are pretty technical and get into the operation and administration of insurance. I'm going to hit a few highlights is all. A state-based exchange would determine whether a particular plan meets the minimum criteria for certifying qualified health plans, the certification process, and which plans are eligible to participate in the exchange. Account management and oversight for qualified health plan issuers would be provided locally through the state exchange. With a federal exchange, the federal government would determine whether a plan met the criteria for certifying qualified health plans, and we believe they could add additional criteria a state exchange would not be required to include. What the certification process would be and which plans were eligible to participate in the exchange. Account management would be provided by federal account managers. State-based exchanges will have the ability to review rates, consider rate increase justifications, policy forms, benefit levels, actuarial plan values, and compliance with market reforms. Each state-based exchange would maintain local authority for oversight of accreditation, market conduct, adequacy of plan level rate and benefit data, and propose changes in service networks, ownership, mergers, or acquisitions. State plans will be able to establish requirements for and decide which individuals and organizations could provide navigator, broker, or assister services. Under a federal exchange, the federal government would do all of those things. With a state exchange, we decide how the operating costs of the exchange are paid. Under a federal exchange, they decide how to pay for the ongoing costs. At this point, the federal plan is to assess a fee of 3.5% of the premiums that are paid. We are very confident the state exchange can operate with significantly lower administration fees. A state-based exchange would have the flexibility to design and operate customer services to best meet the needs of the residents of the state, and to develop customer satisfaction and outreach systems to receive input from consumers in an effort to improve the service they receive from the exchange. Now, Senators, I haven't talked about the advantages of a state-based exchange over a federal exchange in an effort to convince you that an exchange is a good idea. I will repeat what I said at the beginning of my opening debate. I did not want an exchange from the beginning, and I don't want one now, at least not on federal terms. But we will have an exchange on January 1st of next year. The only question is, will it be a federal exchange, a state-based exchange, or some combination of the two? The Idaho Hospital Association commissioned a survey that I just saw yesterday for the first time that was conducted by GS Strategy Group. The survey was conducted on the 4th and 5th of this month. They asked this question. The Affordable Care Act establishes a new way for individuals and small businesses to purchase insurance through health insurance exchanges. These are essentially marketplaces where people can compare insurance plans and choose the one that's right for them. If Idaho doesn't implement its own health insurance exchange by 2014, the federal government will institute a plan for Idaho. Knowing this, would you want Idaho to move ahead now with creating the exchange or wait for the federal government's plan? When responding to that question, 74.4% of Idahoans said their preference was to move ahead with a state plan. 16% said their preference was to wait, and 9.6% didn't know or refused to answer. Now, I know it's important how you ask the question when you're conducting a survey. That's why I read the question to you, so you could draw your own conclusions. I believe it says that when they understand that we will have either a federal plan or a state plan, 3/4 of Idahoans indicate they prefer a state plan. The interesting thing in the survey indicates that it didn't matter which political party the respondent belonged to or which area of the state they lived in. In every case, in every category, over 70% said move ahead with a state plan. Now, I'm willing to continue the legal battle against the Affordable Care Act. I have worked and will continue to work to elect people who will protect free markets. Today, the choice is federal exchange or state exchange. I choose a state exchange because I truly believe it best serves the citizens of the state of Idaho. Senators, thank you for your time. I know that was a little long-winded. Felt it was important we go through the bill pretty carefully. Mr. President, with that, debate is open.
Debate being open, is there further debate?